In the summer of 1260, two camps on opposite sides of the Mongol world raised the same white banner and declared two different men the ruler of everything. Genghis Khan had built. In Shangdu, in the north, Kublai's supporters proclaimed him Great Khan. In the old heartland of Mongolia, his younger brother Arik Burka accepted the title from a rival assembly of nobles. For the first time since Genghis Khan had united the steppe tribes half a century earlier, there were two great Khans, two governments and two claims to an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the plains of Hungary. Neither man would ever rule the whole of it again. Within 4 years, brother would fight brother with Mongol cavalry on both sides. Within a generation, the single empire built by conquest would exist only as a memory, replaced by 4 separate, often hostile Mongol states. And the warriors who had carried that empire across half of Eurasia, the men whose horse archers had terrified Baghdad, Kiev and Krakow, would find themselves scattered across those new borders, sometimes fighting each other with the same tactics their grandfathers had used to conquer the world together. This is the story of what happened to those soldiers after the unity of the empire collapsed. Some became emperors of China, some became sultans who converted to Islam, some vanished into the populations they had conquered, and some kept fighting a war between Mongols that would outlast every one of the men who started it. To understand what the split cost the Mongol warrior class, you first need to understand what they had built and how they had built it. When Temujin united the steppe tribes and took the title, Genghis Khan in 1206, he did something no steppe leader before him had managed to do permanently. He organized the Mongol and allied tribes into a single military and administrative structure, the decimal system dividing warriors into units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000, cutting across old tribal loyalties and replacing them with loyalty to the Khan and to units that fought, herded and moved together. Membership in this structure was not just a job. It was status, income and identity rolled into one. The Mongol warrior of the early 13th century was, by the standards of his era, extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily well provided for. Each man typically kept several horses in rotation, allowing armies to move at a pace no settled kingdom's infantry could match. Historians estimate Mongol armies could sustain movement of 60 miles or more a day under favorable conditions, a logistics feat that stunned every civilization they encountered. Their composite bows, built from horn, wood and sinew, could outrange the weapons of most opponents. Discipline was severe. The Yasa, the body of law and custom attributed to Genghis Khan, imposed collective punishment on units that broke formation or abandoned comrades, which bound soldiers to each other as tightly as fear of the enemy did. What made this force truly formidable was what came after victory. Conquest meant plunder, and plunder was distributed according to a system that rewarded ordinary soldiers, not just commanders. It also meant tribute income flowing from conquered cities, control of trade routes across the reopened Silk Road, and access to the skilled administrators, engineers, and artisans of conquered civilizations, all of which the Mongols were notably willing to employ regardless of their ethnicity or religion. A Mongol warrior in the 1230s or 1240s belonged to the dominant military class of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. His Khan's writ, at least in theory, ran from Korea to the borders of Poland. That unity was never as simple as it looked from a distance. Genghis Khan himself had divided the empire among his sons even before his death in 1227, granting each a territorial appanage, an ulus, while maintaining a single great Khan over all of them from the Mongol homeland. This system worked reasonably well for 2 more generations. Through Ögedei, Guyuk and Mungke, because a strong central succession kept the appanages in line. But the seeds of fragmentation were built into the structure from the very beginning. The empire was never one state. It was a federation of related princely lines held together by the personal authority of whichever descendant sat on the throne in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, and by the fear and prestige a unified Mongol military still commanded. The event that finally broke this system was not a foreign invasion or a battlefield defeat. It was a death. Mungke Khan, the 4th great Khan and grandson of Genghis Khan, died in August 1259. While campaigning against the Song dynasty in southern China, most likely of dysentery contracted during the siege of a fortress in Sichuan. Mungke had been an effective, centralizing ruler father who had pushed Mongol conquest forward on two fronts simultaneously, sending his brother Hulagu west into Persia and the Middle East, while personally directing the assault on Song China, with another brother Kublai commanding forces in the Eastern Theater. His death left no clear, uncontested heir, and in a system where succession was decided by an assembly of Mongol nobles, the Kurultai, rather than strict primogeniture, that absence created an opening. Two candidates emerged, both grandsons of Genghis Khan and both sons of Tului, Munka's own father. Kublai commanded Mongol and Chinese forces in the campaign against the Song and had spent years administering conquered Chinese territory, surrounding himself with Chinese advisors and adapting Mongol rule to a settled, literate civilization. Arik Böke, the youngest of Tului's sons, had remained in Mongolia proper, in charge of the capital at Karakorum during his brother's campaigns, and represented a more traditionalist faction of the Mongol nobility, those who were uneasy about how thoroughly Kublai had absorbed Chinese administrative practices and Chinese court customs. The succession crisis exposed a fault line that had been widening for years between Mongols, who saw the empire's future in continued conquest and administration of settled agricultural civilizations, and Mongols who believed the empire's strength lay in the traditional steppe way of life, mobile, pastoral, and centered on Mongolia itself. Kublai, in southern China when he learned of his brother's death, made a fateful decision. Rather than returning to Karakorum to have his claim ratified by a full, traditional Kurultai, which would likely have favored the Mongolia-based faction, he had a smaller, hand-picked assembly of his own supporters in Shangdu proclaim him Great Khan in the spring of 1260. Arik Böke, in Karakorum with access to the traditional seat of power and a gathering of nobles more sympathetic to his position, was proclaimed Great Khan there soon after by a rival Kurultai. For the first time in Mongol imperial history, there were two men simultaneously claiming the same singular title, each backed by military force, each claiming the legitimacy of a Kurultai, and neither willing to yield. The other Mongol territories, the Golden Horde ruling the western steppe and Rus principalities, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate that Hulagu was carving out in Persia and the Middle East, were forced to choose sides, or more often to quietly use the chaos at the center as an opportunity to act with greater independence than they had ever enjoyed. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a grinding 4-year civil war, fought largely across Mongolia and northern China, between forces that had, until recently, served under the same banners against the same enemies. Kublai controlled the wealthier, more populous Chinese territories and their tax revenue and agricultural surplus. Arik Böke controlled Karakorum and the Mongolian heartland, but that heartland depended heavily on grain and supplies shipped in from China, supplies Kublai could cut off. Kublai used exactly that leverage, blockading and disrupting the flow of grain to Karakorum, and the city that had been the ceremonial and political center of the entire Mongol world began to starve under its own rightful elected Khan. Military engagements between Kublai's and Arik Böke's forces took place through 1261 and into 1262, with fortunes shifting back and forth. But the economic pressure proved decisive where battles alone had not. By 1264, with his supply lines exhausted, his coalition of noble supporters fracturing, and Karakorum itself increasingly unsustainable, Arik Böke surrendered to his brother. Kublai notably did not execute him, a mercy that reflected both Mongol norms about shedding royal blood and perhaps an acknowledgement of how badly a public execution might have inflamed the broader Mongol nobility. Arik Böke died 2 years later in 1266, in circumstances that some contemporary chroniclers suspected, without firm proof, may not have been entirely natural. Kublai had won the war for the title of Great Khan, but he had, in the process, permanently broken the thing the title was supposed to represent. The Golden Horde in the west and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia had had used the years of civil war to act as fully sovereign states, making their own war and peace, controlling their own succession, answering to Karakorum, and later to Kublai's court in name only, if at all. The Ilkhanate under Hulagu, meanwhile, had its own catastrophic falling out with the Golden Horde during these same years, a conflict rooted partly in territorial disputes in the Caucasus and partly in religion, as Berk, Khan of the Golden Horde, had converted to Islam and reacted with fury to Hulagu's sack of Baghdad and the killing of the last Abbasid caliph in 1258. Mongol armies from the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate fought each other directly along the Caucasus frontier. Beginning around 1262, a war between two Mongol successor states, even as the Tuluid civil war between Kublai and Arikböke was still being fought further east. By the time Kublai declared himself emperor of a new Chinese dynasty, the Yuan in 1271, the unified Mongol Empire that his grandfather had built no longer functioned as a single political entity in any meaningful sense. Whatever ceremonial deference the other khanates continued, on and off, to pay him. For the ordinary Mongol warrior, the practical consequences of this fracture arrived, not as a single dramatic edict, but as a slow, disorienting redefinition of who he served and what that service meant. A soldier who had spent his career under Munka's unified command, moving between fronts as the Great Khan's strategy required, now belonged permanently to one successor state or another, depending largely on where his unit happened to be stationed when the empire split. Geography, more than personal loyalty, decided a warrior's future. Those stationed with Kublai's forces in China found themselves absorbed into an increasingly Sinicized military and administrative system. Kublai, unlike his more traditionalist relatives, actively recruited Chinese, Khitan and Jurchen administrators and adapted Chinese-style bureaucratic institutions to run his growing empire. Formerly established as the Yuan Dynasty in Dosetian, Mongol, soldiers in this system retained privileged legal and social status. Mongols occupied the top tier of a four-class ethnic hierarchy the Yuan state imposed, above Central Asian and other foreign auxiliaries, above Northern Chinese, and above Southern Chinese, who ranked lowest despite being the most numerous population in the empire. But that privileged status came bundled with a demand: serve a state that looked, administratively, less and less like the mobile steppe confederation their grandfathers had fought for, and increasingly like a conventional, if Mongol-led, Chinese dynasty. Those attached to Hulagu's forces in Persia and the Middle East, forming the Ilkhanate, faced a different set of immediate pressures. The Ilkhanate's court had to govern a population that was overwhelmingly Muslim and Persian-speaking, administering through Persian bureaucrats even while the ruling military elite remained Mongol and, initially, largely committed to traditional Mongol shamanism or, in some cases, to Buddhism and Nestorian Christianity, both of which had significant followings among Mongol elites, including Hulagu's own wife, Dox Khatun, who was a Nestorian Christian. This religious diversity within the Ilkhanate's ruling class, sitting atop a Muslim-majority population, would prove to be a source of chronic instability, working itself out over the following decades in court factional struggles and eventually in wholesale religious conversion. For soldiers stationed with the Golden Horde on the western steppe, ruling over a largely Turkic-speaking population and a mix of Rus principalities, kept in a state of tributary vassalage rather than direct occupation. The immediate aftermath of the empire's fracture meant increasing cultural and linguistic assimilation into the Turkic-speaking Kuman Kipchak populations who vastly outnumbered the ethnic Mongol ruling minority. This process, sometimes called Turkicization, was already underway before 1260, but accelerated once the Golden Horde's rulers had no practical reason to maintain close ties to a distant and now openly hostile Ilkhanate, or a Yuan court thousands of miles away. Perhaps the starkest immediate loss was symbolic and administrative, rather than material. Karakorum, the city Genghis Khan's son Ögedei had built as the empire's capital, the place envoys from the Pope and from the courts of Europe had traveled to reach, lost its central importance almost overnight. Kublai relocated the effective capital of his own Khanate first to Chengdu, and then to a newly built city on the site of modern Beijing, which he named Dadu, Karakoram, cut off from the wealth of China that had sustained it during the Civil War, declined into a secondary Mongolian town, still significant locally, but no longer the beating heart of a world empire. For warriors and their families who had built lives, status, and community around that city and the court it had housed, its diminishment was a very tangible, very personal kind of loss. What happened next to the Mongol warrior class is best understood not as a single story, but as at least four distinct and diverging paths, one for each of the successor khanates, plus a fifth, smaller path followed by those who chose neither conquest nor administration, but quiet retreat, back into the pastoral life of the steppe. The first path belonged to the warriors who became, in effect, Chinese emperor's soldiers. Under Kublai and his Yuan Dynasty successors, Mongol military units remained a distinct, privileged caste for over a century, garrisoned in strategic locations across China, exempt from many taxes and legal penalties that applied to Chinese subjects, and formally forbidden by law from fully assimilating. Intermarriage and adoption of Chinese customs were, at various points, actively discouraged by Yuan policy specifically to preserve a distinct Mongol military identity that the dynasty depended on for its legitimacy and its army. Individual Mongol commanders under Kublai, men like Bayan of the Barin, who led the final conquest of the Song dynasty in the 1270s, achieved enormous prestige and became central figures in Yuan court politics, effectively continuing Mongol military careers within an increasingly bureaucratized Chinese imperial framework. But this arrangement proved brittle when the Yuan dynasty collapsed in 1368 under the pressure of rebellion, famine, and internal Mongol succession disputes of its own. The last Yuan emperor, Togun Temur, and his court fled north back to Mongolia, taking a portion of the remaining Mongol military elite with them, founding what historians call the Northern Yuan, a rump Mongol state that would persist, fractious and diminished, on the steppe for centuries, while other Mongol soldiers who had settled too deeply into Chinese society or who were simply unable to flee in time, were absorbed into the new Ming dynasty's population or, in smaller numbers, into its own military as auxiliaries. The second path belonged to the Ilkhanates Mongols in Persia and the Middle East, and it is one of the most striking transformations in the entire post-imperial story. These were warriors descended from men who, under Hulagu, had destroyed Baghdad, ended the Abbasid Caliphate, and inspired terror as far as the borders of Egypt. Yet within 2 generations, their own ruling house, converted to the religion their grandfathers, had helped nearly extinguish in the region. In 1295, the Ilkhan Ghazan formally converted to Islam, and much of the Mongol military aristocracy in Persia converted alongside him, a conversion driven by a combination of political calculation. Since ruling a majority Muslim population as openly non-Muslim, conquerors had proven a persistent source of friction and rebellion, and genuine gradual cultural assimilation over decades of intermarriage with local elites and exposure to Persian court culture, scholarship, and administration. Mongol warriors of the Ilkhanate increasingly adopted Persian language, dress, and customs, even as they retained military command positions. The Ilkhanate itself did not long outlast this transformation as a unified state, fracturing into competing regional dynasties after the death of the last widely recognized Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, in 1335 without a clear heir, but the Mongol military lineages that had governed it did not vanish so much as dissolve into the Turco-Persian ruling class of the successor states that followed, a class that would go on to shape the political culture of Iran, Iraq, and the wider region for generations. The third path belonged to the Golden Hordes, warriors on the Pontic and Caspian steppe. Here, assimilation followed a different cultural direction. Rather than converting toward the religion and language of a conquered, settled population as in Persia, the ethnically Mongol military elite of the Golden Horde was gradually absorbed into the far more numerous Turkic-speaking Kipchak and Cuman populations they ruled over, adopting Kipchak Turkic as their everyday language within a few generations, a linguistic shift so thorough that the very identity of the ruling group came to be known to outsiders, including the Rus principalities they held as tributaries, not primarily as Mongols but under the term Tatars, a label that has persisted in various forms into the modern era. The Golden Horde itself converted to Islam under Khan Uz Beg in the early 14th century, following a trajectory broadly similar to the Ilkhanates, though arriving at it independently and for its own political reasons. Its warriors continued to campaign, raid, and extract tribute from Rus principalities for another 2 centuries, but the Golden Horde as a unified state gradually fractured in turn during the 15th century into smaller successor khanates, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, the Khanate of Crimea, and others, each inheriting a portion of the old Mongol-Turkic military tradition, and each eventually conquered or absorbed over the following 2 to 3 centuries by an expanding Russian state that had itself spent generations as their tributary. The fourth and smallest path belonged to those Mongol warriors, particularly from Arikboka's original power base and from later generations, disillusioned with the increasingly foreign administrative styles adopted by Kublai's successors and by the Ilkhanate's converts, who simply withdrew, as much as circumstance allowed, back into a traditional pastoral and nomadic existence on the Mongolian steppe itself, resisting both the bureaucratic Sinicization pursued in China and the religious and cultural conversions pursued further west. This conservative steppe faction persisted as a distinct political and military tradition, and it was from among their descendants, and the descendants of the northern Yuan, refugees who joined them after 1368, that later Mongolian khanates and confederations, including the Oirats and the various Mongol groups that would repeatedly clash with, and occasionally threaten, the Ming dynasty over the following centuries, ultimately emerged. Individual stories illuminate these broad patterns. Bayan of the Barin, Kublai's most celebrated general, died in 1295, having spent his final decades as a senior statesman. Within the Yuan court bureaucracy, he had helped conquer China to establish a Mongol warrior whose career ended not on horseback but in a council chamber. Ghazan, the Ilkhan whose conversion reshaped Mongol Persia, died in 1304 at only 32, having spent his short reign attempting, with mixed success, to reform Mongol taxation and administration along lines his Persian advisors, particularly the historian and vizier Rashid al-Din, helped design, an advisor whose own monumental history of the Mongols, the Jami al-Tawarik, remains one of the single most important surviving sources for the empire's history precisely because it was commissioned by a Mongol court that had, within a lifetime, become thoroughly Persianized. Togun Timur, the last Yuan emperor, fled Beijing in 1368 as Ming forces closed in, dying 2 years later in Mongolia. A great Khan's descendant reduced, much like the Mughal emperors India would produce centuries afterward, to ruling a fraction of what his ancestors had once controlled. Did the Mongol warrior class, as a distinct historical force, truly disappear after the empire split? Or did it simply change shape? The honest answer is that it did both, depending on where you look and what you count as continuity. In China, Mongol military and ethnic identity as a privileged, legally distinct caste effectively ended with the fall of the Yuan Dynasty in 1368, though ethnic Mongol communities persisted and continue to persist today, both within China's Inner Mongolia and in the independent nation of Mongolia, whose modern population traces direct cultural and, in many cases, genealogical continuity back to the tribes Genghis Khan first united. In Persia and the broader Middle East, the specifically Mongol military tradition dissolved almost entirely into the Turco-Persian political culture that succeeded the Ilkhanate, though its influence on regional administration, court ceremony, and even architectural and artistic patronage lingered for centuries in states like the later Timurid and Safavid dynasties, both of which claimed forms of connection, real or constructed, to Mongol and Turco-Mongol prestige. In the western steppe, the Turkicized descendants of the Golden Horde's Mongol warriors evolved into the various Tatar and related Turkic peoples whose khanates, kingdoms, and communities remain a significant presence across Russia, Ukraine, and Central Asia today, their historical memory carrying forward both the prestige and the trauma of the Mongol imperial legacy in deeply contested and still politically sensitive ways. Popular memory has often flattened this genuinely complicated afterlife into a much simpler myth, the idea of a single, monolithic Mongol Empire that rose suddenly under Genghis Khan, and then, just as suddenly, vanished from history after his death or shortly after. A narrative arc, convenient for popular retellings, but badly misleading. In reality, Mongol-descended states, in one form or another, continued to rule substantial portions of Eurasia for centuries after the original empire's political unity collapsed in the 1260s. The Yuan Dynasty ruled China until 1368. The Golden Horde's various successor, khanates, persisted in diminished but real form into the 16th, 17th, and in Crimea's case, even the 18th century, when Catherine the Great's Russia finally annexed it in 1783. Central Asian Chagatai, successor states and Timurid rulers, themselves claiming descent from Genghis Khan through the female line, shaped the political landscape of the region for another 2 centuries. There is also a persistent romanticization worth separating carefully from the documented record. Popular culture, both historically among some of the successor states themselves and in modern film, fiction, and video games, has frequently cast the post-split Mongol warrior either as a tragic, doomed figure clinging to a vanished golden age, or as a seamlessly triumphant conqueror whose bloodline simply became the new ruling elite of Persia, Russia, or China without friction or loss. The actual historical record shows something messier and, in its way, more human. Generations of soldiers and their families navigating genuine, difficult choices about language, religion, and loyalty, often making different choices from their own cousins, depending on which khanate they happened to serve, with real winners, real losers, and outcomes that varied enormously by region and by decade, rather than following any single tidy pattern. So what actually happened to the Mongol warriors after their empire split apart? They did not disappear, and they did not remain unchanged. They fractured along exactly the same lines their empire did, becoming the privileged, embattled military caste of a Chinese dynasty until that dynasty fell in turn, becoming Persian-speaking Muslim commanders governing the very civilization their fathers had once been sent to destroy, becoming Turkic-speaking Tatar nobility astride the steppes of Russia and Ukraine for centuries, and for a smaller number, simply returning to the pastoral steppe life their ancestors had followed before Genghis Khan ever united them at all. Their unity had always been a political achievement rather than an ethnic or cultural inevitability, and once the political structure that held it together broke in 1260, the warriors who had built the largest land empire in history were free, and in many cases forced to become something new. It is worth asking, the next time you hear the Mongol Empire described as a single unbroken force that simply faded away, which of its 4 successor states and which of its scattered soldiers you are actually picturing. If this story of an empire's slow, complicated unraveling was as fascinating to you as it was to research, let me know in the comments which of these 4 paths surprised you the most. And if you haven't already, subscribe to After the Sword for more stories of what happens after the fall.